We are very happy to introduce Professor Innocent Pikirayi as our speaker today. He is a professor in archaeology and the head of the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology at the University of Pretoria. He is a Zimbabwean archaeologist specializing in the rise, development, and demise of state societies in Southern Africa. And today he will be presenting on decolonizing archaeological practice beyond community engagement towards a theory of the future. We're very happy to see all of you here today. We're very happy to see you here, Professor Pikirayi. And as always, the Q&A afterwards will happen right after the talk. Please send your questions via the chat or use the virtual hand raise button. That's very important. And I will now pass on to Professor Pikirayi. The stage is all yours.
Thank you very much, Kim. I just also want to acknowledge, Laura and Sultanate for the invitation to your seminar series. Thank you so much for the generous comments regarding my work. You do mention the prevailing systemic racism and lack of diversity and inclusion in the academy and beyond. This is what we are experiencing in archaeology and the related disciplines. And this is something that we have always struggled to resolve on a daily basis in our professions, as administrators and as practitioners. I must say that archaeology is still confronted with serious transformational issues post the formation of the World Archaeological Congress in 1986 into the new century, the century that we are currently in at the moment. Tragically, we seem to have ignored the transformation, sort of transformational imperatives, going into this century, and consequently, we have been confronted with some of the worst challenges to our work as archaeologists and heritage managers. And these challenges include calls to decolonize our practices, and this is one of them. Racism, for example, has refused to go away. And in fact, it is on the rise, encouraged by what is going on in certain parts of the world. Now, this is one of the reasons why I got into a conversation with so many people on this topic. First, the South African Academy in the early 2000s when I went to South Africa, and then subsequently with Peter Schmidt. And therefore, the volume community archaeology and heritage decolonizing, practice is not really something that one could call groundbreaking in terms of what happened or should have happened in transforming the discipline of archaeology in Africa and beyond. And here I can also mention in passing some of the works that do inspire me, such as the work of Linda T. Smith on decolonizing methodologies, and Liebman and Risby on archaeology and the post-colonial critique. But rather, what I'm saying here is a stark reminder of the potential consequences of the failure to do a decolonized approach to archaeology. Now, the publication of our volume, Decolonizing Practice, coincides with some of the most violent episodes of student protests in South Africa, which called, among other things, that we should decolonize universities and the way knowledge is produced in Africa, South Africa in particular. And since then, there's been considerable conversations about decolonization of research and the curriculum in South Africa, in Africa, and beyond. And crucially, the question is, how do we do this? And if we were to decolonize, what form should decolonization take? Surely, you do agree with me that this cannot be a one-size-fits-all kind of exercise. And what I'm offering here is just a very minimal perspective of how I've approached this topic, this challenge, and what I think in theoretical terms, what decolonization is all about. Now, in this seminar, I discussed decolonization in terms of what is called, what we refer to as epistemology, in terms of methodology, and in terms of pedagogy, sort of as a way to articulate, contemporary archaeological theory, and also as a way of communicating the discipline to non-specialists, and further to rethink about approaches that we are approaching, that we think are appropriate when we are collecting data. Now, since decolonization invokes so many matters and so much matters theoretical, I, at this stage, would like to invoke what Rosemary Joyce referred to as the languages of archaeology. That was way back in 2002, that is almost 18 years ago, or in fact, more than 18 years ago, as a way of providing a critical examination of the relationship between archaeology and the approaches used to communicate to non-professionals. Now, since archaeology or archaeologists work with communities, I want to go beyond this and call upon a theory of the future that premises many realities, in quotation marks, realities that I think are congruent with historical experiences, with languages, as well as with what we call habitus. And in the end, I want to pose the question whether archaeologists can recognize and draw upon local as well as Western realities in working towards inference or best explanation, and in the end conclude by the seminar by stressing that perhaps as archaeologists we need to pay more attention through listening to our peers, in other societies, and to our peers within the context in which we work, so that we strengthen the kind of work we do. In other words, we strengthen archaeological practice as well as the interpretations that we lend to our data. Now, when invoking, in quotation marks, what I call the language of archaeology, and that's drawn from Rosemary Joyce, I want to go beyond Joyce's argument that archaeology is a complex exercise in storytelling, which not only involves knowledge acquisition and production, but also uses storytelling in creating communities. And I mean, this is not anything new in the work that we do by establishing cultures and traditions, for example, which is culture historical. We have been creating communities. And by looking at the past in the manner that we are trying to do in the present, we are still in the process of creating communities. So the language that I'm talking about is one that allows the expression of ideas by means of communication and engagement. So I therefore treat archaeology as a discipline with languages, in quotation marks, that not only engage contemporary theory, but also listen to and share knowledge, as well as lending experiences. Now, if you take a language in the manner that it is, in linguistic terms, a language is a medium of communication. One uses language to engage, and to effectively engage and communicate, one must listen to what is happening around him or her. Engagement or engaging is also a process that involves knowledge sharing. It also involves experiences, sharing of experiences, or sharing of what has been found, in other words, data. And the same applies to the language of our disciplines. This is now the language in quotation marks. And here I'm now specifically talking about archaeology. Now, in the context of decolonization, the core issue here is whether we understand the language or the languages in plural of archaeology and are able to share their message to non-archaeologists in a manner that allows them to appreciate the discipline, finding it useful to their own circumstances. In other words, as archaeologists, we should not just speak to ourselves, communicate to ourselves, and be satisfied by our own results. Our own results should be able to be shared with others, and they should be able to understand what we are talking about and be able to use what we are communicating, not only among ourselves, but to them as well. Now, this particular slide, gives a range of what I expect to find, in decolonized research, and curricula. And what one can see that, or let me say, it is by no means an exhaustive list. Now, my own perspective in terms of decolonization is highlighted in the very last bullet point, where I regard decolonized archaeology as one that promotes alternative ways of seeing and engaging the world. One that encourages local ways of thinking and knowing. And to me, that forms the basis for engaging Western forms of knowledge, some of which, as you are aware, marginalizes and dehumanizes. Now, I want you to add to this that such archaeology, and this is not on the bullet, such archaeology must address the past and contemporary human condition and have direct relevance and resonance with local or descendant communities. Now, put differently, such archaeology must not just be archaeology as usual, but rather an archaeology whose impact resonates beyond its practitioners. This is what I personally call the archaeology of the human condition. It perhaps remains subjective. It's something that is theory in the making, something that I'm currently developing, but something that is open to challenge and open to continuous conversation. And using this approach, please allow me to take you through my case studies to demonstrate examples of what I think decolonized archaeology on the African continent is. Now, originally, I intended to present 3 case studies, starting from West Africa, running through East Africa. In fact, in West Africa, I wanted to focus on work that has been done, archaeological work that has been done in Lake Chad, looking at the work of Graham Cohn and others, and then going to the region of East Africa, looking at Kilimanjaro and its melting glaciers and the lower slopes as well, looking at what has recently been done, and then ending the discussion by my own work as well as the work of others by looking at Southern Africa in terms of the work that people are doing in Great Zimbabwe. So due to time constraints, I'm going to limit myself to 2 case studies, the Mount Kilimanjaro one and Great Zimbabwe. For the West Africans, please forgive me for that. If it is a case for me having to do another seminar on the disappearing Lake Chad, please allow me to do that. It's an excuse for you to organize another seminar on that, because Lake Chad and what is happening at the moment gives us a unique opportunity to discuss the challenges archaeologists confronted given the unique challenging circumstances that that region is currently encountering. So please allow me to go to Mount Kilimanjaro, which is Africa's highest mountain, and crucially a mountain that commands a very unique ecosystem And this ecosystem, whether you look at the summit, whether you look at the middle of the mountain, whether you look at the lower slopes of the mountain, is interconnected. You can't talk about one without making reference to the other. You can't pretend one is only self-containing without talking about the other. And this is what one experiences when dealing with that kind of an ecosystem. But the interest that we should, as archaeologists, focus on is really the cultivation zone, which is the lower slopes of the mountain, which of course is attached to the rainforest and other regions as you go up until you reach the Alpine glaciers. Now, this is home, as some of you might be aware of, to the Chaga people, who are cultivating a range of crops, and the banana being the staple food. The Mount Kilimanjaro forests above this zone are vital sources of water for the surrounding towns and the wider region, but one must also not forget the glaciers that are found further on the summit of the particular mountain, which provide additional water to what the Chaga depend on. Now, for centuries, the Chaga were part of this complex ecosystem, not living as a unified entity. Traditionally, they have always belonged to clans, who sometimes fought each other or formed alliances with one another just to try and leverage power among themselves. And this history is well known and remembered in oral traditions, as well as in the archaeology, which is showing complex stone structures in terms of underground fortifications, in terms of bolt holes that you see on this slide, as well as water management features that I'll show you in a subsequent slide. I want to mention here the recent work by Dr. Valence Layo on water management, on bolt holes and fortifications in this particular ecosystem, which makes truly fascinating and refreshing reading. To me, this human history has been missing. Human history is told through archaeology and trying to link archaeology with the ecosystem, and of the mountain, for example, has been missing or has remained undocumented for a while. And the obvious research focus on and around this mountain, for those who have Googled or read about Kilimanjaro, is not what is happening on the lower slopes, but rather the ecology and the climate change that we often associate with, the higher parts of the mountains, and these are the glaciers. Now, these topics, as you may be all aware, are outside archaeology and history, and sometimes, if not always, make one question the relevance, when talking topics which I would call in this context highly occluded, because they don't make resonances with what is happening within a more relevant context. Now, speaking about glaciers on Kilimanjaro have all been done by external researchers, mostly American universities. Here I can talk about Ohio University, I can talk about the University of Massachusetts, I can talk about the College of New Jersey. Fascinating results, I must say. What we get here are results and projections talking about the concerns for climate change in general. But what one sees here is very little on a reference to the Chaga people who are living on the foot of the mountain. And further, when you read these fascinating discoveries, scientific discoveries, and they should not be dismissed because they serve a community, a scientific community, despite their lacunae, despite what they lack. The big question they pose is not whether Kilimanjaro's glaciers are sinking or shrinking, but rather why they are doing so, and why all of us, the world over, should be concerned. And we know from reading what these climate scientists have done is that these retreats have been documented since the late 19th century. You need to read the work of Hans Meyer, the first European to scale the, known to scale the mountain. And we can see that, the ice on the summit, which is Kibo, is retreated by 100 meters on either sides, or on all sides. And in some cases, the ice is only half as thick as it used to be. And as scientists project, and one can see from this particular cave, these glaciers have been projected, to disappear completely, based on studies done elsewhere. By 2015, mind you, they are still there. Possibly 2020, or that was last year, they are still there, and 2025, possibly they may still be there if you take into account some of these, glaciers. Now, there has been a lot of scientific work done on top of that, on that mountain, as well as the establishment of weather stations, to try and understand the work that has been done in terms of, the developments of the Holocene, sequence in terms of climate change and possibly cultural change. And what we seem to be getting is, period of, abrupt climate changes from 8,000, 5,000, 4,000 years ago. And whatever projections these climate scientists are making, they seem to point to a very negative future of this unique ecosystem. Now, put simply, if Kilimanjaro is to use its glaciers, if the glaciers are to go away, the repercussions would be extremely serious. Now, particularly for the survival of the chaga and other groups living on the lower slopes of the mountain, because the glaciers are supplying water, the rainforest is also supplying water for irrigation. And more broadly, if scientists, climate scientists are to be believed, what is happening here is simply a macrocosm of what could face the entire world in the future. And more important is how the chaga would cope with this, at least in recorded history, and what their experiences are in terms of the water that they are drawing upon, not only from the rainforest, but also further up from the melting glaciers. So already there is noticeable loss in terms of wildfires, in terms of forest clearance on the lower slopes of the mountain. I'm talking about the cultivation zone, I'm talking about the rainforest, of the ecosystem. Now, which, could result in some of these critical water sources, being reduced in terms of what they are supplying, or, completely drying up. But then what I found interesting about the work that Valens Silayo did was to engage at least with the lower slopes of the mountain and parts of the rainforest. I would not fault him for not engaging with the rainforest. I mean, with the ecosystem further up. But the bottom line is what you see happening in the lower slopes and what is happening further up is really connected and integrated. In other words, as archaeologists, our conversations should not just be about ourselves, but we should be speaking beyond. In other words, engaging beyond, ourselves, to be able to say, what exactly are climate scientists talking about when the issue about glaciers on Kilimanjaro are said to be diminishing? What are the consequences in terms of a society that is probably confronted with, what one would call decline, if not collapse? And that takes me to my own research area of Great Zimbabwe, which is my second study, a site that is dated from the 10th or 11th century, the 16th century, an urban complex, where all I'm doing here is to highlight the centrality of sort of a management practice, not in terms of stone building, but rather water, and in the possible origins, developments, and demise of an ancient city. Now, when one looks at Great Zimbabwe, which in my view is the most colonized archaeological site since the 1870s, at least in Southern Africa, when Europeans tried to appropriate it. The traditional approach has been to establish who the builders of Great Zimbabwe were and when. And of course, they had claims that the Phoenicians, the Arabs, the Jews, the Indians, Dravidians have been authors to this ancient, city and settlement. And then what you also see is the culture history of the settlement, and that is taking the archaeology from the then colonial, sort of deep colonial archaeology to sort of sanitized culture historical approaches, where we see the settlement developing from the hill to other parts of the sites. I would see that as standard archaeology. And then, in the last 20 plus years, there's been a more robust approach to the settlement, in terms of trying to understand, Great Zimbabwe settlement system, how it is spread to, much of the Zimbabwe Plateau and beyond, and, how the site is linked not only regionally, but also, broadly continentally. In other words, we're talking about Africa and Asia, and to a limited extent, Europe. So crucially, yes, a settlement which played a role in the globalization of Southern African subcontinent. But what we need to understand, for a truly decolonized archaeology here, is that there is a lot more to Great Zimbabwe than just culture history, than just dating and chronology and material culture. So a number of researchers are focusing on all these topics that I've listed here, from dating through monumentality, use of space, resource use, the built environment, the stone-built environment, the growth of the settlement, urbanism, the relationship between the center and the periphery, resource management, etc., including heritage matters, which is, archaeology plus other ways of looking at it. And my focus, for the purposes of time here, is simply water, and that's why I've highlighted it here, in blue and in capital letters. Why water? Is that beyond the stone-built structures, Great Zimbabwe is also these scars that you see on its immediate landscape, which are evidently, extensive pits that were dug in the past. And it is clear when you look at this pits that they were originally dug for clay that was used in the construction of the houses, either on the higher parts of the sites or within the the stone settlements that you find nearby. Now, the subsequent map shows you the distribution of such pits. This is a reinterpretation of the LIBOR LiDAR image that we have of Great Zimbabwe, but looking at it from a hydrological perspective. And I want you to pay a particular attention to not only these hydrological features, because for Great Zimbabwe, people would think, well, I haven't seen a stream or two. This is what you get actually. But also, you have a look at these black markings here, which are called the perimeter walls, the inner perimeter wall, and then the outer perimeter wall here. And then also have a look at these features. I hope you should be able to see them in yellow. Also here, and some of them here on the top of this hydrological feature here or line here. And so there is a projection, in terms of where these things are, are located. And I'll say exactly what it means in terms of the interpretation or reinterpretation of the sites. So from a geoarchaeological perspectives, where we are analyzing soils, and I want to thank one of my colleagues here, Dr. Federica Sulas, that from geoarchaeological service and analysis, soil microanalysis reflect these features as fish started to be managed in a manner to ensure water was able to cater for a growing population. And I want to call this approach that we are doing excavating water, which is an approach which is very difficult to think in tangible ways. It's very difficult to dig water and analyze it from a stratigraphic point of view. So I say this fit is rarely possible, but it's an approach in a decolonized context where we have to think about methodology in a different way. So it then becomes possible, really, when you think along those lines, to say to understand Great Zimbabwe beyond culture history by reinterpreting Great Zimbabwe, in ways that resonate with people's own experiences of the site, and then what it means to them, in terms of the present. For me, Great Zimbabwe is a site too monumental to ignore or simply be lumped into sort of ordinary, conventional, historical narratives. So here, when we are reinterpreting Great Zimbabwe only from the perspective of water, one can then look at those artificial, those cars as artificial reservoirs, that would store water to cater for the needs of the city. And if we are to compare what we are looking at, whether we are looking at apples with oranges, what we are talking about here is whether such features do resonate with social political complexity when sites grow this big. And we do have examples in Mesoamerica among the Maya, where people start engineering their own landscapes, and such kind of hydraulic engineering we associate with significant growth in terms of social political complexity. Now, this also is implications on our understanding of the use of space and the traditional approaches that we have used in understanding Great Zimbabwe, or really almost for many in Southern Africa. Apparently, I would say novel, but in quotation marks, is the approach used by Tom Huffman in using Shona ethnography to understand Great Zimbabwe, to say how do we understand Great Zimbabwe in terms of its usage. But then when you look at it from a hydrological point of view, we do seem to get new ideas or nuances in terms of how space could have been used. So back to what I was talking about in terms of the perimeter walls, these features here that I alluded to in an earlier slide, and this is a map and case of Professor Chirikure. The only thing that is missing in this particular map is that in between these perimeter walls and a few on either side, you do seem to be getting those scars, which are, in my view, water reservoirs for this particular settlement. So, to me, it's an hydraulic feature rather than a space feature that seems to be catering, apparently, for the growth of the settlement. To say originally the site was this big, and then when it grew, it then had to accommodate an additional population, and then it had another wall and things like that. It's an imaginative way of looking at Great Zimbabwe, but new evidence would show you that we're looking at things differently. Now, another critical question would be the fate of Great Zimbabwe in recent history. What happened to the urban center after the middle of the 16th century, for example? And what you have, the only window that is recorded in written documents by the Portuguese in the middle of the 16th century is this document by João de Barros in the Asia, which tells us what Great Zimbabwe was and its context and the kind of struggles that were happening within the area, and nothing more. It doesn't tell us how Great Zimbabwe came to an end, but it simply points to you that something is happening within Great Zimbabwe as part of a larger setting, as part of the the sort of the broader Great Zimbabwe Plateau. So again, it gives us a chance to re-engage Great Zimbabwe, and it makes it possible to view Great Zimbabwe from other perspectives, such as climate change, collapse studies, and the historical settlement shifts that we know happened on the Zimbabwe Plateau post the 16th century. Now, for me, I've been re-energized to have a relook at the medieval climate optimum when Great Zimbabwe was in existence, and then the little ice age, which we have actually set aside for the period 1600 to 1850, because both have got a bearing on the water quality of Great Zimbabwe. Now, for the work that we are doing in terms of geoarchaeological research, what do the surveys tell us about the changes in the landscape? Was there sort of an environmental catastrophe that one could point out that would lead to the site being simply left or abandoned, depending on how you want to, to see collapse? And also, how do you explain, regional settlement shifts in this part of the world when you are looking at them, or when you're looking at, power and how, it was constituted in Southern Africa? At least we know for the period slightly later in South Africa for the Sotho-Tswana, that there's always been this domino effect of settlements moving from one region to the other, from the southern part of the High Veld right up to the northern part of the High Veld into Botswana. And what could be happening in or on the Zimbabwe Plateau that we could try to understand Great Zimbabwe, given oral traditions on the origins of the Mtapa state, the Nambia state, and other state systems that were lesser in terms of size to Great Zimbabwe. What is that we know about, for example, the kingdoms in Central Africa, Yoruba, Lunda? How much have we drawn from that? Something that seems to me is fairly silent in terms of trying to engage, with the archaeological record. Now, I could say that on and on, but I know time is limited. So I now have to revert to theory to understand and put together the presentation that I have been given. to make to you. And this involves sort of invoking the archaeology and language that I've talked about at the beginning to understand Great Zimbabwe's climate and water situation, the chaga, whether the site collapsed or whether the chaga will collapse, and what our investigations in both East Africa and Southern Africa are telling us about these landscapes and bearings in the present. So crucially then, what happened. So the most critical then question is, if you have read this book, Decolonizing Anthropology by American anthropologist Faye Venetia Harrison, who asked a very crucial question in 1987. This was just a year after the formation of the World Archaeological Congress, that can an authentic anthropology emerge from the critical intellectual traditions and counter-hegemonic struggles of third world peoples? And can a genuine study of humankind arise from the dialogues, debates, and reconciliations among various non-Western and Western intellectuals? This was a telling question, which is still relevant today, and which for most of the work that we do as archaeologists and even as anthropologists, we have not succeeded in terms of resolving. Now, some of us would like to believe that this is attainable in that theory in future will have to premise many realities. And by that, we're talking about realities that are congruent with our experiences, historical experiences, including the language that I've been talking about, and including the habitus that I've alluded to. Archaeologists need to recognize and draw upon local as well as Western realities as they work towards inference to the best explanation of past events and the material culture that they are working with. And one of the things that they need to invoke and involve in what they do is listening, because listening, in my view, and the view of this, the group that we've collaborated with in coming up with archaeologists of listening, is something that strengthens archaeological practices and interpretations of the data that we generate. And listening also is imperative, and I think morally strategic in the work that we do. So what I'm saying here is part of the conversation that is not new. It started around 2015, was fossilized at the Society of American Archaeology meeting in San Francisco and post-San Francisco in 2016. And then there was a symposium that was organized for the World Archaeological Congress in Kyoto in 2016. And then you've got this volume here called The Archaeologists of Listening that was published, I think it was in 2019. Now, this calls for listening over and above the engagement and sharing of knowledge that we have advocated for the past decade or so. For the chaga, in the lower slopes of Kilimanjaro, for Great Zimbabwe in Southern Africa, this is possible. And I want to assure you, the results are truly, truly refreshing. Colleagues, to conclude, the major question is, why do we have to decolonize? Of course, we need to correct the scholarly wrongs of the past. And once that is done, we also need to create a platform in which to honestly engage with the rest of the world. And this is where I am. I'm not just here to critique decolonization in terms of Europe as the metropole and Africa as the victim. Colonization comes in and also happens in different stages. It's also about domination and control. You can also be a colonizer in your own terms without knowing that what you are doing is dehumanizing and demeaning the other. That's the challenge that we have when we're talking about decolonization. It's no longer the colonization that we're talking about post the Berlin Conference 1884. It has now taken new nuances and new forms. Now, as Africans, or as practitioners of archaeology in Africa, we always have to humble, or we always need to have what is called epistemic humility to be able to decolonize. And this is what we can do to make this world, or to take this world forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pikirayi, for this very, very powerful talk. Now we're opening the Q&A session, and just please raise your hand, or you can just, if you would like to, you can write into the chat, and I can help you to read it. Yep. Before, I think that, yeah, let me ask a question, Professor Pikirayi. I clearly understand that the water, for example, is a very important source in Africa, and I'm quite sure that this is very important source of information for you from local community. But do you really think that the Western archaeologists really miss this point when they make the research, and it just and also what is the best way to avoid the situation when we do not listen to the local community? What should be done from your point of view?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people can argue that we don't have the local community. Sometimes they can argue that we don't even have a resident community, and that what we are dealing with is material culture, or a context that is far removed from any of the communities that we are dealing with. But regardless of that situation, and here I can take you to East Africa. How do you conduct archaeological research, let's say on the Stone Age, or paleoanthropological research on human origins, let's say among the Maasai in the Rift Valley? Are you going to dismember, or rather disjuncture them from the context in which those fossils are found? Are you arguing, or would one argue, for example, that they are not part of what we are dealing with, and therefore they should not be consulted? Now, this is a telling issue that you need to recognize the context in which who is resident, at least. If you are not able to identify who one can be referred to as the local community in that regard. So it then becomes an issue of power dynamics here, to say, if I want to do this, I'm going to do that regardless of who is on this particular site or in this particular context. But I think you need, in my view, to level yourself down, to exercise what I call epistemic humility, to say, look, I'm going to work in a context and ensure that I do get the respect of the people that I'm going to conduct my research in, because whatever they know, or what least they know, they'll help you take your research to another level. That's how I can respond to your question for now.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Other questions? Please raise your hand. Yes, okay, I see the has any questions? I'm quite sure that we have questions.
Is there been a question to me? No? No?
Okay, I think that it was such a powerful talk that we are still under great impression, and yeah, I think that we still can, just any maybe remarks, any comments.
I have a question, if I may, Innocent.
Yes, of course.
Please go ahead, Paul.
Thank you very much for that really inspiring and interesting presentation. You prefaced your presentation, and in fact in the abstract that you provided, with a reference to the student protests in South Africa.
Yes.
Yet one of the things that didn't quite come through for me is the extent to which your experience of dealing with that, and I know you had particular responsibilities at your university at that time, how that might have shaped and created some sort of critical reflection on your own practice that has informed what you have presented to us today. I wonder whether you could just elaborate a little bit on that.
That's a very good question, Paul, and I appreciate that. You see, I was not surprised with the student protests of 2015, 2014 thereabouts, because already, I was part of this reflection in terms of what archaeology needs to do, in Southern Africa, and particularly in South Africa. And also coming to South Africa as I did in the early 2000s, I was part of very difficult conversations with South African archaeologists and administrators of archaeology about several transformation imperatives in South Africa in terms of what archaeology needs to be and needs to attain. And I would say post-1986, the formation of the World Archaeological Congress, for which South Africa was central to that. South Africa actually resulted in the formation of the World Archaeological Congress by default. It might, colleagues in South Africa might agree or might not, they might disagree. But at least I understood the context. So I had already started these conversations, and even in situations where I felt I was ignored in terms of how to to go forward, I decided either to to park the boat or the bus, as it were, or simply take another trajectory. That is why I came up with this volume about archaeology and tradition on Mapunguge, where one of the things that developed in 2007, 8, and 9 was a directive from the state, the South African government, to say human remains that institutions are keeping in South Africa, university institutions rather, have to be reinterred back at Mapunguge. And the solution had to be found overnight. So ultimately, I had to be part of that conversation. And whether colleagues had been comfortable with what I was saying originally or not, we simply had to work together. And by the time the student protests came in, some 6 to 7 years or 8 years later, personally, I was comfortable because I knew what needed to happen in terms of the research that we do, as well as the kind of curriculum that we needed, in terms of teaching, in archaeology, that in my view, or in the view of, Professor, Harrison, would be truly liberating in terms of one's conscience and in terms of what one needed to learn.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Professor Will, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. And thank you very much to you, Innocent. It's really interesting stuff. You mentioned early on in the talk about decolonizing and diversifying the epistemologies, the methodologies, and the pedagogies. Can you recommend some resources to learn more about some of the non-Western epistemologies, methodologies, and pedagogies that could be employed a bit more?
Yes, I can, but certainly I won't be able to be exhaustive in this particular context. And remember, when I'm talking about the World Archaeological Congress, what we are talking about is those voices that are beginning or were beginning then to emerge from the so-called peripheries of knowledge or the powers of knowledge. I would like to say I'm one of those who benefited so much from studying in Europe and engaging with the theories that were emerging in the 80s and 90s. Particularly the theories that we are coming from Ian Hodder, from Christie, and from the other. And being framed within the context of the processual and post-processual, and being asked by our supervisors to say, think about this and think about this. But the good thing that I got from my supervisor was that he did not demand that I template or I align my theory with sort of the dominant thinkings that were happening, let's say at Cambridge, at Southampton, and other American universities, and this is where we got we got our tutoring from. So I would go from from there to look at the work that was beginning to emerge, and one of the most inspiring work that I see from an archaeological perspective is the work of Linda T. Y. Smith, Decolonizing Methodologies. And then the engagement that was done from an anthropological context by Professor Faye Venetia Harrison, who is a Black American scholar who worked for so many years at the University of Florida, Gainesville. I now know she has moved somewhere else, and she did engage not only with the American Anthropological Association, then the Black Caucus, but also she was also instrumental not so long ago in South Africa when the protests came in. She was visiting South Africa, and she even gave a number of talks at several universities in terms of how a decolonized curriculum or sort of anthropological science would emerge. So I would start from there, but I would not prescribe to say these are the only sources. There are so many, and I'll be really willing to engage one-on-one with you and the others to say perhaps these are some of the sources that we read. The crucial line is we should be in a position to re-engage the so-called center of knowledge and be in a position to be able to see what other centers or other institutions that are perceived to be in the periphery are actually offering in terms of alternative ways of knowing the world and presenting the world. And I haven't said anything about Asia, for example, because I barely know anything about what is going on, in let's say in India. Although I'm making some inroads into some Chinese and Japanese archaeology, but they too would make refreshing reading if one is to engage the world in that context.
Thank you very much. Another question from Susan Hackenbeck. To what extent would you say that decolonizing efforts in archaeology are aligned with global movements for climate justice?
I wouldn't want to see an alignment as such, but rather when one is decolonizing a methodology and an approach, there should be an element of relevance in terms of why you are doing that. You don't simply decolonize in order to challenge existing paradigms, but you also decolonize in order to be able to see the context in which you are doing a certain thing is relevant to your own circumstances. This is why I made references to climate change when it came to Kilimanjaro, and to climate change when it came to, it comes to Great Zimbabwe, because these are imperatives. And these imperatives do speak to the current human condition. So in my view, a decolonized archaeology, a decolonized discipline is one that really addresses the circumstances of the contemporary human condition, including climate change.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Do someone maybe wants to ask a question or make any comments for this session? Okay, if not, thank you very, very much, Professor Pikirayi, for this very powerful talk, and thank you for joining us, all the audience. And yeah, let's applaud to Professor Pikirayi, and please join us for our next session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure being part of this conversation and to seeing colleagues that I have not been seeing because of the global shutdown and the pandemic. I would like to wish everyone well, and I hope we'll be able to meet physically one-on-one in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.